We've been marching through David establishing his kingship, and here we're going to pivot to probably more of the section, unfortunately, of David's kingship that folks are more familiar with as we start moving towards the time period of his sin with Bathsheba and the consequences thereof. But we'll be picking up in chapter 9 to start with, so we have just a few more moments of the positive usage of power that we see from David. Chapter 9 will introduce us to this fairly radical thing that David does, and it is his relationship with Mephibosheth, which is based off of his relationship with Jonathan. So if you remember, you have Jonathan, who was David's closest friend, just knit together like brothers. One of the things that I like to do when you look at the lives of these two men is, aside from pedigree differences, there are a lot of parallels between the choices Jonathan makes and the choices that David makes. And you can really see, oh, why did these two guys get along? Why did they love each other so much? They really are of the same type. And both very brave, both deeply faithful to the Lord, and willing to stick their necks out there to trust God in a very real way. You see that with Jonathan and the Philistines. You see that with David and Goliath. And so these two build this friendship together. But unfortunately, in the process of David inheriting the kingship, there is a death of Saul and Jonathan, along with Saul's other sons. And so in chapter 9, as David is now established, he's won victory after victory. He's enthroned in Jerusalem itself, a united kingdom. And we're introduced to this question he'll ask: is there yet anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? It is what is fascinating about this whole thing is how different this is a usage of power versus what kings typically do. Right? So typically, if somebody becomes king and their dad wasn't king, in the ancient world, that meant you killed the guy. That's almost always how it went down, right? Is that there was some sort of rebellion, some revolt, and the previous king is usurped, and his entire family is wiped out. And David refused to do that, was not involved with that at all. As we've talked about before, he refused to raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. And yet now, God kind of did that for him. Right, so God does really wipe out the house of Saul without any involvement of David. And in fact, some very clear points where David makes it clear, I will not be involved and I will not honor anybody involved in it. And so here, him asking this question, is there anyone left of the house of Saul? If you were to have any other king in the history of all of the nations ask, is there anybody left of the house of fill in the blank, the past guy? You know what's coming. We want to find him so we can wipe him out. That's not what happens here with David. With David is the exact opposite. It's this beautiful picture of him with fondness and love remembering Jonathan and saying, is there anybody of the house of Saul? And connecting those two, understand, I mean, he was not a dumb guy. He understood. In honoring anybody related to Jonathan, he was, by default, honoring the house of Saul. Right? He says it in the question. And yet he's willing to do it, which is not the way typically power was treated or used. So in this, they go searching, and there is a man named Ziba, and he will point out, yes, there is a man. His name is Mephibosheth. He is crippled in both of his feet. We find out that all of that, in fact, happened as his nurse was fleeing for their lives when the house of Saul was laid waste to. And so Mephibosheth is, I mean, if you think about this position that Mephibosheth is in with the house of Saul being gone, this guy's crippled in both of his feet. What's his life look like? What are his possibilities for income? Absolute zero, right? You go to the New Testament, and you think about in the New Testament, if I were to say, do you remember the guy in the New Testament who was lame in both feet? Where was he? Outside the temple, begging for money. That's it. That's the life of somebody crippled. And so in Mephibosheth's case, that would absolutely be the future that awaited him because, and one of the things that we see is, all of the land and holdings of Saul have been evaporated and given away with that household gone. And what will happen is David will instead restore those to Mephibosheth. And when he does that, this entire scene is a beautiful example of grace, in my opinion. David asks, is there anybody at the house of Saul? They find, they say, well, there's this guy Mephibosheth. And then you get down to verse 6, and it says, Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, and he fell on his face, and he prostrated himself. And David said, Mephibosheth, and he said, here is your servant. At this point in the story, if you were to just kind of put yourself in the mind of Mephibosheth, which I wish there was some way I didn't have to say that name so many times tonight, as he is prostrated himself on the ground before David, what is likely, we don't know what's going through his head, but what is likely running through his mind at this point? Yeah, this is it. I'm right at the end, right? And so when David says his name, what's the first thing he says? Your servant, right? It's like, don't hurt me. I'm here to help. I'm your buddy. I'm not against you. And instead of what was expected, and frankly, from a human standpoint, what that household deserved. Not saying Mephibosheth had done anything wrong, but isn't that the way that things work, right? Is that the mistakes of Saul, in a purely human sense, will affect his whole family. Instead of that happening, David's going to show grace. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's very much, this is a great example of when we talk about the idea of David being a type and pointing a foreshadowing of Jesus. This is a great example of that. Mephibosheth will describe himself in verse 9. He'll say, what is your servant that you should regard? And then he calls himself a dead dog, right? That you regard a dead dog like me. Here, what David is doing is figuratively taking a man from death and giving him life, right? Mephibosheth understood, I'm as good as dead. I have no protection. I have no income. I have no source of caring for myself. I'm completely dependent on the mercy of David. And then you think about, as Tony pointed out, this foreshadowing of Jesus. That's us. We are Mephibosheth. We are the dead dogs. We are the ones completely dependent upon the grace and mercy of God. And, of course, David shows that mercy. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So you have not only, like you said, I mean, any sort of kindness would be impressive, right? Any sort of goodwill that David were to show to him would be a wonderful thing. But there's a full restoration, right? And that's a very New Testament word, isn't it? That idea of being restored and renewed. And he doesn't just restore the land, but actually Mephibosheth isn't going to hang out in that land at all. It will specifically say, where does he move to? He's going to move into Jerusalem. He's going to live in that city, and he's going to eat with the king every day. There is such a beautiful New Testament picture there, right? That if we are Mephibosheth, not only is there a restoration of things, but it's not a far-off one. It's not a, hey, I'll show mercy to you, but now out of my sight. Off to some corner of the kingdom where I don't have to look at you. No, I want to keep you close. I'm going to treat you like family. And I will really honor you in a way that you've completely not deserved at all. And so it's a really beautiful picture of David using his power in a gracious, merciful way. And I think that it's important for us to remember that because we're going to hit chapter 11 here pretty quick, right? Where we see the impact of power in a negative way. Any comments or questions? Yeah. Yes. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. One thing that you definitely see in the kingdom of David is that David is beloved by the people by and large, at least before chapter 11. There comes some problems later on, but at this point, yeah, absolutely. And again, that's a foreshadowing, right? Our king, he's not just our king, and we submit to him and his sovereignty, although we do that too, but we love him, and he is a king that is worthy of that love and adoration. Okay, so from there, we'll move to chapter 10. In chapter 10, I want you to kind of combine some of the things that we saw in chapter 8. So chapter 8 starts with, after this it came about that David defeated. And in chapter 8, you get all this list of battles where David went to battle against his enemies, and he wins a battle after a battle after a battle. Chapter 10 will jump back to that, but we'll specifically talk about the nations of Ammon and Aram. And there is a difference between the victories of chapter 8 and the victories of chapter 10. In chapter 10, David is not looking to expand his kingdom to take over the land of the Ammonites and the land of the Arameans. So the Ammonites are in that orange territory. That's where they lived. The Arameans are up in that territory that we would think of as being associated with Damascus or Syria. And then actually another one that is mentioned back in chapter 8 that is kind of a surprising one is the yellow and Edom. These were not part of the initial promised land territory. These are kind of extra areas that are going to be gained by David. And what's interesting is David doesn't go looking for these battles, but he may not start it, but he's going to finish it. And that's kind of how that works. What chapter 10 points out is the Ammonites, their king dies, his son then reigns in his place, and David sends delegates or ambassadors to show kindness to him. Those ambassadors are mistreated, specifically what is done to them. Yeah. Cut the clothes in half, cut the beards in half, and it's it's an unfortunate style look. Let's just put it that way. Very shameful, right? Especially to Jews who, what was the law? Pop quiz on the Old Testament law. What was the Old Testament law regarding your beard? You're not allowed to shave it, right? And you're not even allowed to trim it. You can't trim the corners of your beard. And so there were very distinct rules on the way that Jewish men were to take care of their facial hair. This is a direct affront to that. And so it is a call to battle. David then goes to battle against the Ammonites. The Ammonites get scared because David goes to battle against them, not really sure what that young king was thinking. I think this is a classic example of the son becoming king and then acting the fool. But they hire some mercenaries from Aram, and they join the battle, and you get this epic battle scene of Joab and Abishai, who are the two sons of Zeruiah. The two sons of Zeruiah, they were the nephews of David, who oftentimes caused him problems, but boy, could they fight. And so these two guys essentially divide the forces and stand back to back and take on these two armies, and God gives them the victory. So what chapter 10 ends up doing is giving us this expanded kingdom of David that was completely unexpected. At this point, chapter 8 was kind of, here are people who are active enemies, and then David finds some peace on every side, and then he's just trying to have peace with the surrounding nations, and they decide to fight him. He ends up winning. It expands the territory. And so as you look at chapter 10, it's an interesting way that David's kingdom ends up spreading. He doesn't go looking for blood. It does seem to find him. But then you get down to the very end of that chapter, and down starting verse 18 and 19, the Arameans fled before Israel, and David killed 700 charioteers of the Arameans and 40,000 horsemen, and struck down Shobach, the commander of their army, and he died there. And when all of the king's servants of Hadadezer saw that they were defeated by Israel, they made peace with Israel and served them. So the Arameans feared to help the sons of Ammon anymore. So David's empire is now growing to the point where some of these other kingdoms are serving David's kingdom as kind of vassal nations. Even if they are not fully conquered by David, they are servants of David. And that, by the way, will just continue with Solomon. Solomon will just expand those borders even further. Anybody have any comments or questions or anything they saw there in chapter 10? I really summarized that, but something that stood out to you that you'd like to note. Okay, we'll say, so from there, now we're going to move into chapter 11. And so chapter 11, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about David's sin with Bathsheba. I'm always hesitant to say you're familiar with the story because some will be and some won't. So we're going to take a moment to connect ourselves to the account here in chapter 11. We won't read all of it, but we'll read at least the beginnings of it. It happened in the spring, at the time when the kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the sons of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David stayed at Jerusalem. Now when evening came, David went to bed and walked around on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful in appearance. So David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" And David sent messengers and took her. And when she came to him, he lay with her. And when she had purified herself from her uncleanness, she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David and said, "I am pregnant." And so from there, it will set off a series of events of David attempting to cover up that sin. He will call for Uriah from the battlefield in the hopes that he will come back, give a report, and then lay with his wife, and nobody will ever know. That does not happen because Uriah refuses to go to his house when all of his soldiers are out on the battlefield. He will eventually ask Joab to make it look like a battle casualty, but make sure that Uriah dies. And he adds the added layer of horror to it of writing that message to Joab, sealing it with the king's seal, handing it into Uriah's hands, and Uriah carries his own death note back to Joab. And by the way, if Joab was ever feeling like maybe he should have a little bit more of a conscience and he should think about the kind of person he is and remember to be more like David, what happened to David's influence with Joab from this moment forward? It's gone, right? You've destroyed it. You've destroyed your reputation. Joab has spent all this time with David and seen him as the guy who takes the high ground. But now compromise has shown up, and now he's just like Joab. We're just right in the same. So all of this happens, and one way for us to look at this is just simply say, okay, so David sinned, he tried to cover the sin, he lied about it, but God caught him. And all of that would be true. But what I'd like to do is to break it up into some specific elements of this, because sometimes I think we can run over something like this because of the familiarity with it and miss some of the finer points. So we're going to break this up. If you've got the worksheet, you can kind of see already how I've broken it up. We'll break it up into temptation. We'll look at power and responsibility. We'll talk about facing our sins, the role of confrontation and Nathan's role in this, and then consequences and repentance, because all of those things get talked about in this section with David and Bathsheba. So let's start first with temptation. When you look at David pursuing Bathsheba, what are the underlying factors that lead to this temptation? Why does this happen in the first place? Because a lot of it is laid out directly in the text. Yep, so you start chapter 11, and it happened in the spring at the time when kings go out to battle. The Holy Spirit describes that a specific way, doesn't he? The time when kings go out to battle, that David was back at Jerusalem. Well, who's David? He's a king, so he's not where he's supposed to be. Yeah. Was that what you were going to say, or you... He wasn't where he was supposed to be. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so that's one element to it, right? He's not doing the work he ought to do, and that creates a vacuum of time. How many of us have ever done the wrong thing simply because we had too much time on our hands? Right? That's a very clear temptation issue that comes up here in chapter 11. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't speak to that. I can only speak to what the text says, right? But regardless, when he sees her, what does he do next? He sends for her. He inquires about her, right? Like, that's the first thing. Hey, tell me more about that lady, right? What's biblically speaking, in the New Testament, there is one word, one verb associated with lust over and over and over again that is the most common verb ever used in terms of lust. You know what it is? Sin, flee. Yeah, somebody said flee. Yeah, it is sin. Lust is sin, and you're supposed to flee it. If you think about somebody else in the Old Testament that was confronted, and we do know with this one, was confronted day by day, Joseph. Yeah, and he fled, right? So here's David. He sees her bathing. The biblical answer is flee, right? You absolutely run away from that. And in that case, it probably doesn't even have to be a run, does it? It's just let me look this way, right? But he doesn't. Instead, he inquires. Anything else involved in this temptation? Yeah. Beauty? Yeah, and we need to recognize the fact that that's part of being human, right? And so you need to be aware of that. Yeah. More than one? Yeah. He had quite a few at this point. Not as many as his son. His son will get the record. But yes. Yeah. It would have been a normal thing. Eh. Yeah. But I will also say, I will add to that, though, I do understand what you're saying, and that may very well have been in his mind, right? It's like, I'll inquire and see if she's single. But I will also add to that, one of the first things that God told his kings was do not take many wives. So even if he is inquiring her for that reason, we got to go back to Pam's question, how many wives does he already have? So, I think, yes. Yeah. Right. Yeah. But she's back. So 3. At least. Yeah. Yeah. At least 3. Zach, did you have something? It was that? Okay. Yeah. So, yeah. And here's the thing is, I do tend to agree that when he inquired, that's probably what he's thinking. Right. Yep. I get it. But I also think, what was the problem he had with the ark in the first place? Go back to the story of the ark, right? He's bringing the ark. Uzzah dies. Why does Uzzah die? He didn't inquire according to the rule, right? He doesn't go back and say, hey, what are the rules here for how it should be done? I think as king, he's got to go back and check the rules. That's the other thing that goes with, because I get it, but I think that's another layer of the temptation. You're not checking the rules enough for yourself. And so, yeah. Yes. Yeah. Have you met men? Are you unaware? I'm not justifying it, Pam, but I'm pretty sure you understand that is not a surprising thing, right? Yeah. I am not justifying this. For the record, I am not justifying David's behavior. Can we understand that I am not justifying David's behavior here, okay? Like, but is it possible that he's like, yeah, she's pretty. I want to marry another one. Don't care about her IQ? Yeah, that's definitely a possibility, Pam. Yeah. Okay. I bet you he didn't remember all their names. Yeah. Right. It is an abuse of power. It is 100% an abuse of power. Because, as you said, anybody else calls for another man's wife to come to see him at his house, she doesn't do it. But he's the king, and he can use that power that way. Yeah. Well, and if he didn't know before, he certainly knew after the inquiry, right? So what you see here with the temptation, one is there's layers of digging, right? You keep digging the hole deeper. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Absolutely. All of that. And yeah, 100%. So, okay, we paint this picture of David as a really bad guy in chapter 11. And it's very easy to see all of the different forks in the road where he could have averted disaster. But can we remember for a second that this is also the guy that God loves so very much? And the reason I say that is we can make the mistake of looking at this and as armchair quarterback going, well, I would never, and I can see all the mistakes he made. It's as clear as day. And not realize that this could easily be us. That these sorts of roads to sin and deception and to covering it up and getting worse and worse and worse are human roads, right? And they show up in our lives 1,000 times where you're just going through life and you think everything's fine and you kind of cruise control for a little bit. Let me put it that way, as David not going out to war. He's on cruise control a little bit. Hey, everybody else has got it. And then all of a sudden, when you're enjoying that prosperity and not focusing on your responsibility with it, all of a sudden that's exactly where sin comes in. As you look at life, life tends to be the most tempting when things are going the best. Right? There are temptations in suffering too, but I think the temptations of prosperity are much more common, and if you look at us, we live with a lot more prosperity than adversity, I think. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, in the case of David, I mean, he's very clearly attempting to hide it. It's literally written down. We're literally reading every detail he was trying to hide, right? So there is nothing hidden from the eyes of God. And if he feels like writing it down for everybody to read for generations to come, he can do that too. So, yeah. Anybody have any comments or questions I missed? Yeah. Right. Yeah, that is the New Testament idea, right? Is that maybe I didn't go through with the actions that David did, but maybe that's also because I don't have the power that David did to go through with the action, right? But the desire to do the wrong thing is, God recognizes that intention just as well. Yes. Oh, yep. Well, and I think the text bears out what you're saying too, right? Why is he trying to cover it up? He's trying to cover it up because he knows it's wrong, right? You, yeah, yeah. I mean, but I don't think there's any room for us to say it's an unintentional sin. I think there's too many things. Now, he could probably look back and go, I didn't mean for it to go this far, right? But there is intentionality in all of it. Yeah. That's an excellent point. Yeah, this is not like in some foreign territory or something like that where you kind of would have your guard up, right? I'm at home. Things should be safe here. But it, that's not always true. Yes, and then yes and yes. So I got three right there. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, making it worse. Yes. You're right. Um, there's not just fornication. This ends up leading to murder as well. Yeah, Roger. Mm-hmm. There you go. 7. Yeah, 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 yeah. Can we agree he didn't need any more wives? Can we agree on this idea? Right? Yeah. So absolutely. So as you look here at this, you've got this temptation. We've talked about the idea of power and his responsibility with it. So we kind of have um, flowed through some of these things already. The next piece of it, though, is he will have to face those sins. And here's the thing. At first, I think the first question I have on there on the worksheet is, when did David realize his sins? And we've already kind of touched on it. It's not when Nathan talks to him. That's not the first time David realizes his sins. And here's how you know. He keeps trying to cover it up. He knew it was a sin way before then. He just didn't realize how bad he had become until Nathan confronted him. And I think that's an interesting thing, because I think in life that is a tendency of us as people, as to look at a sin and we go, yeah, I know that's wrong and I know I did that wrong thing. And I'll just try and fix it and kind of adjust. But I'm really a good guy, right? I did that wrong thing, but I'm a good guy. And we do that for sometimes years of, I did that bad thing, but I'm a good guy. And what Nathan says is, you're not a good guy. And he points that out to him. Yeah. Yes. Yep. And then more and more problems. Yeah. Yeah. Snowballed. Exactly. Yeah. So when we talk about David facing his sins, one of the things that is a good rule of thumb for us is, if you are trying to cover it up, if you feel a need to keep it private from others, that should be a good indicator that maybe you're not doing what you ought to do. Right? Um, I will say, one of the things that I tell all men, it would be good for women too, but it's men typically that I end up talking to about this, with your internet history and everything. I am a big proponent of accountability software. And all that means is, accountability software isn't even a filter. It doesn't like filter stuff out. All it does is, whatever you see on the internet, somebody gets a report of what you saw. I will tell you, it changes the way you use the internet when you know that somebody will see a report of what you looked at. You can, it's not the kid gloves. It's not like, oh, you're a little kid, you can't, you got to go ask mommy if you can look at this website. You can do whatever you want, but somebody's going to know. And I will tell you, like for me, I've had accountability software on my computer for, I don't even know how long now. I mean, years. And there will be times, I was preparing to preach a sermon on homosexuality, and I had to go tell Jenna, hey, there's going to be some things on the report. You know what I mean? But it's just a conversation, right? It was just me just walking out and saying, hey, just so you know, this is what the sermon's going to be on. There's going to be some things that probably show up. And because I have to have those conversations with somebody, and that doesn't have to be your spouse that you make your accountability partner, but just from a practical standpoint, I am a big proponent of it, because one of the things that I think has happened is we have this technology that has allowed us to anonymously live. And that's a power that David had, to feel the sense I can do whatever I want without consequences. That's what anonymity does. And so if you feel that something you're doing is something you want to cover up, that's just a general rule of thumb, that's your brain, your conscience telling you, hey, maybe think about this a little bit. Okay. Next week, we're going to talk about Nathan and his role in this. But spoiler, Nathan's a brave guy, and God gives him a very difficult job. And so we'll talk about that next week. But otherwise, we're going to shut down there. We are at 7:43. No buzzer, no trap door. Everything's good. They kept me honest.